You're listening to Retrospection Radio Theater from the creative mind of Noah Martin, brought to you by Retrospection Multimedia. It takes a lot of work to bring you these stories, and so I'd like to point out that we have a Patreon and Ko-fi in the description. A small donation of $5 can get you access to exclusive content and help keep Madison, Maine afloat. We are proud to bring you Retrospection Radio Season 5, Future Imperfect. Elliot Cooper spent most of his life as a nondescript and unassuming man. In fact, he was so forgettable that his so-called friends hardly ever remembered to invite him to parties and outings. On those rare occasions when he did manage to get an invite to a party, he generally stuck to the corner of the room and spent as little time interacting with people as possible. Elliot Cooper graduated high school with average grades, no social life, and no extracurricular activities. At least, not one that involved other people. College didn't come knocking for him, but he did apply and managed to get accepted at Worrell University, the college located on the outskirts of Madison, Maine. Even though he lived in Madison, he wanted to branch out and expand his horizons and become someone different from his high school persona. However, in reality, it was the same old Elliot in college that he was in high school, spending most of his time looking from his dorm window and wishing that he were someone else. Someone with an outgoing and interesting personality, and who people invited to things. He graduated with a degree in business, the most common degree for a college graduate within the United States, and the easiest degree to receive from Worrell. After graduation, Elliot Cooper decided not to leave Madison and instead stayed in a small, one-bedroom apartment with his pet hamster, Teddy. Elliot chose the name of Teddy for his hamster because he thought it was a unique name for a pet, and if he really had any true friends, he hoped one of them might have been named Teddy too. Unfortunately, as it turned out, Teddy was one of the most common pet names in 2021, the year he received his pet hamster. In his overabundance of spare time, he would watch his hamster run on its wheel while he sang Michael Jackson songs, poorly. Within a year of moving into his new apartment, Elliot Cooper's rent was raised by nearly $200 due to inflation. Elliot decided it was best not to argue with his landlords and simply started paying the extra $200. He had hoped that, perhaps, he might receive a raise from his employers due to the rising cost of living and inflation. His employers threw him and his coworkers a pizza party as a celebration of their outstanding performance and contributing to the company receiving record high profits in the fourth quarter of 2021. Yes, to say the least, Elliot Cooper was as interesting as a box of wet socks, though nowhere near as smelly. The first day of the month starts off the same as every other day of the month. In most people's lives, but especially in Elliot Cooper's life, change is rare. There's not much of a difference between a Tuesday and a Thursday, and the only day of the week with a possible inkling of change is Friday, because sometimes his boss lets the office go a half hour early. For Elliot, this change doesn't bring on the sense of excitement that the others in the office felt when being granted an early release, as he had no place to go and nothing in particular to do, except see Teddy. As with every other day for the past 5 years since graduating college, Elliot Cooper rose from his bed after turning off his alarm clock. Dressed in tighty-whities, Elliot stumbled over to his closet, which he promptly opens, with the little energy he could muster. It is 6 a.m., far earlier than Elliot preferred to be awake for work, but a feeling that he had grown to simply accept as normal. After pulling a white button-down shirt, khaki pants, and dress socks from his wardrobe, Elliot walked to his small, barely human-sized bathroom and turned on the shower. He stripped and held his hand to the water, waiting for it to warm up. Yet it never did. It seemed as though the apartment's water heater was broken yet again. With a heavy sigh, Elliot Cooper stepped into the freezing cold shower and quickly washed himself. 20 minutes later, Elliot was sitting at his tiny two-person dining table, dressed in the same clothes as he wore every Monday to work, eating the same piece of toast slathered in generic brand peanut butter, and drinking a cup of bitter, scorching microwave-heated coffee with no flavor. He finished his meal, packed a refrigerated tuna salad prepared the previous evening, and added a bottle of mineral water for lunch. He broke off a piece of celery and a singular carrot, then placed the vegetables in Teddy's cage. With exhaustion clawing at the very reaches of his soul, Elliot Cooper opened the door and stepped out onto his front porch. Nothing more than a 3x3 cracked concrete slab. He bent down, grabbed the latest daily issue of the Madison Gazette, and without looking at it, placed it under his right armpit and stepped off the concrete slab. As usual, Elliot arrived at work 5 minutes early. He clocked in less than 1 second after the timer hit 7 a.m. By 7:05, Elliot had said his good mornings to his co-workers and logged on to his computer. The computer booted up slowly, and Elliot, as he did every Monday, wondered to himself why the company, which was making so much profit, would not upgrade the computer system from the early 2000s to a model from within the past decade with a currently supported operating system. The computer finally booted and the Windows XP login screen greeted him. He signed in to the work network using his company-provided employee number and waited another minute as the connection completed. He then clicked on Microsoft Word XP and began his day of editing company legislation. Shift away from the same events you've heard from history class over and over again. Listen to bite-sized historical stories that drift from the normal frequency of history. Retrospection Multimedia is proud to present Frequency Drift. New episodes on Thursdays at 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Real history. Real life. Reality. Tell your stories through Retrospection Multimedia, an audio-visual organization dedicated to helping you succeed. We offer video editing, live event and podcasting services, and now, for a limited time only, sign up for the Ground Up Deal. The deal includes podcast consulting, editing, and coaching services. We will also create your own podcast website and RSS feed. Within a few weeks, your podcast will be available on every podcatcher. Order now at www.retrospectionmultimedia.com. Now, back to this episode of Retrospection Radio Theater. For Elliot, every day felt like a crawl to reach noon. But for some reason, today was exceptionally so. The minutes ticked away, and every second felt like an hour. As a child, Elliot did not think that he would spend his adult life combing through legal documents while sleep-deprived and depressed. Yet, as children, most of us don't realize that the thoughts and aspirations we held would melt away into the same monotonous lifestyle we'd eventually become accustomed to. We'd always believe that we'll amount to something greater than the office work that we've done for nearly 50 years of our lives now. We'd always believe that we'd get to see our children grow up and change before our very eyes, to spend our waking moments being good mothers and fathers. We'd always believed that we'd be the ones to make a difference in the world. But those thoughts and ideas burned away in the angsty fires of teenagehood and young adulthood. Reality kicked in, and soon a recognition of perpetual sameness slapped us in the face like a debt slapped to a degree. It must change someday, thought Elliot Cooper as he erased an Oxford comma from the 57th line on the second page of a 200-page document expressing a recommendation to the heads of the company to change the name of a product from Easy Living Candle to Simple Living Candle. After all, I'm only working here for a little bit more time until I have enough money saved up to move to another town. And then I'll make it big. Elliot Cooper would be destined to spend the rest of his life living in Madison, Maine, never moving more than 10 miles from the outside the city if nothing changed about his life. One time, he did vacation to Portland, Maine, with a girlfriend of whom he would eventually break up with due to living disputes. It seemed as though Elliot Cooper would never amount to anything in his life, and would instead live out the rest of his days fixing minor grammatical errors in documents which would only ever be seen by a small group of individuals reading through the documents at such a rapid pace that they wouldn't even notice the minor errors in the first place. Is this my fate? He thought. Is it the fate of a man in his 20s to spend the rest of his days working a meaningless job to pay off a meaningless debt for a meaningless degree at a meaningless college? A debt for a degree, by the way, which did not help him remotely in completing the tasks required of his job. Well, if this were true, then he, Elliot Cooper, wouldn't be the protagonist of any story, let alone his own. Would he? Could someone so uninteresting and void of humanity be written about for multiple pages at a time and listened to by podcast listeners everywhere? Well, I suppose that's something you'll be learning soon enough. Elliot Cooper felt his stomach rumble. It must be noon, he thought, excited to eat the tuna fish salad he had packed for his lunch. He saved the document he was working on, turned off his screen, and walked 30 seconds down the hall from his cubicle to the break room. As always, he pulled his lunch from the fridge and sat down at a circular table as far away as possible from the one and only exit. His fellow co-workers came and went, grabbing lunch, chatting with one another about their family lives, and purposefully ignoring the quiet person in the corner. Elliot didn't mind. He preferred to eat alone on workdays. It allowed him to not get too jealous of the far more interesting lives his coworkers likely led. So, in quiet complacency, he removed the morning newspaper from his little bag he carried with him everywhere and began to read. He scoured through the headlines. Madison Mama caught and killed in violent cave-in. Journalist Royal McNeil goes missing. The Madison Meerkats have beaten their rivals in Colmsbury. A new legislation in the county has made walking on sidewalks with open cans of soda illegal. A strange combination of headlines today, but nothing that strayed too far from the ordinary that caused Elliot Cooper to believe that each and every one of them was not true. Elliot Cooper continued reading through the newspaper. Tech giant promises a new factory built in northern Maine. Global warming crisis impacts lobster industry. Less blueberries this season than normal. Here's why. No, none of this was interesting to Elliot Cooper. Yet it was what he always did, and thus it is what he would continue to do. Local salesman wins lottery, receives $15. Podcasts overtake football as America's favorite pastime. Your boss will die in a car accident. Wait, that last one was not like the others, thought Elliot as his eyes skimmed from the headline to the opening paragraph of the article. Local boss of a team of legal copy editors will die in a car accident tomorrow at 6:42 a.m. as he is on his way to work. He will be T-boned by a white sedan going 5 miles per hour under the speed limit. The driver of the sedan will survive with multiple broken ribs and a dislocated left index finger. The boss, of whom will be named in tomorrow's obituary, will die upon impact and suffer only minor pain before death. Our thoughts and prayers go out to the family, but specifically for his team, of whom will be sent home early from work. Our condolences for the lost pay. Strange, thought Elliot Cooper as he placed the newspaper on the table and stared at the blank beige wall in front of him. Perhaps someone was having fun in the office or cracking jokes. Maybe it was a writer on their last day, and the newspaper ran out of time to cut out the joke in the article. Elliot finished the rest of his lunch thinking about the article. He grew annoyed. After all, this was the reason he didn't interact with his coworkers during work. It led to his mind wandering rather than focusing on his work. He returned to his desk and had trouble combing the last 73 pages of the partially edited request. He grew annoyed that the newspaper allowed an article like this to slip past them, and by the end of his shift, Elliot Cooper decided that, instead of going home to eat dinner and spend time with Teddy, that he was going to Madison Gazette. Whomever was in charge of releasing the newspaper must know that, for whatever reason, an employee published a ridiculous and fake article about the death of a person within Madison. Elliot Cooper arrived at the front doorstep of the Madison Gazette roughly 30 minutes after he left work for the day. An annoyance that had been brewing from deep within him for a few hours now, he opened the door to the Gazette and stormed into the building. He was greeted by a rather old and male receptionist.
"Hello. I'm afraid most of the journalists have already left for the day. I was just about to pack up myself. Is there anything I can do for you?"
Elliot Cooper slammed the newspaper down on the receptionist's desk. "What's this?" he exclaimed, finally allowing his annoyance to bubble out. The receptionist took the newspaper from the edge of his desk and opened it. After a few moments, he responded,
"I believe this is today's newspaper."
"Of course," Elliot exclaimed, "but it's within the paper that's wrong. Flip to page 3. The receptionist did so and took another moment to read the paper.
"I'm sorry, I don't see anything wrong."
"The story," Elliot Cooper began, "about the future death of a local within the town of Madison? How can a newspaper predict the future death of someone?"
"That's weird. This newspaper is identical to today's, but this story is not in the paper. The story here is about as normal as it comes. Steve Richards paid off a college debt to one of his little leaguers. Not what this is. Did you add something to the paper and come here hoping for a refund?"
"No, I didn't do anything to the paper," Elliot annoyedly exclaimed. "Let me see another copy of today's paper."
The receptionist handed Elliot another copy of the Madison Gazette. Elliot flipped through the pages, and, sure enough, the article within this newspaper was about Steve Richards and college debt. "If you didn't do anything to the newspaper, then I'd imagine that someone else did. Perhaps the neighborhood boys played a prank on you." Yeah, perhaps," Elliot agreed as he took his morning paper from the receptionist. He bid the man have a good evening and then returned home to Teddy. Besides that particular encounter, the rest of Elliot's evening was exactly the same as the previous evening and the evening before that. It was the following morning that life finally changed for Elliot Cooper.
It is surprising to me that most simple folk are so desperately afraid of change. We saw in the previous episode that a singular difference in an article of the local newspaper was enough to send Elliot Cooper directly to the Madison Gazette in annoyance, only to find out that his particular newspaper had likely been fiddled with. A stir from the normal pace of life was enough to send Elliot Cooper to bed in a great annoyance. But Elliot was also filled with hope. He hoped that there would be no further changes to his morning newspaper when he woke up on the first Tuesday of the new month. He hoped that his life would return to the usual cycle and have no further changes. He hoped that his minor event today was only a hiccup in the average life he lived. Of course, we both know there's no fun in the same story we live every day, in and out. Now, that's why we listen to stories, right? To hear somebody else's life change so that we might be satisfied with living our own the same as it has been. Well, I can guarantee you that this is the first day of a new life for Elliot Cooper. I cannot guarantee you, however, that listening to this story will change your life. Like Elliot, we can only hope. Elliot Cooper spent most of his life as a nondescript and unassuming man. He drew no attention from passers-by, and often even his own friends forgot he existed. The second day of the month starts off the same as every other day of the month. The changes between waking up on a Monday versus waking up on a Tuesday were merely non-existent to someone used to living the same life they've always been living. As with every other day for the past 5 years since graduating college, Elliot Cooper rose from his bed after turning off his alarm clock. Dressed in tidy-whities, Elliot stumbled over to his closet, which he promptly opened with the little energy he could muster. It was 6 a.m., and, just like yesterday, Elliot was rather tired and not looking forward to work. His mind had been completely wiped free from the change in his life the previous day, not because of some magical mind-altering force, but because Elliot was far too tired to put energy into attempting to recall if yesterday hadn't been the same as the Monday before it. After pulling a brown button-down shirt, light khaki pants, and dress socks from his wardrobe, Elliot then walked to his bathroom and turned on the shower. He stripped and held his hand to the water, waiting for it to turn warm before he remembered that the water heater in his apartment had not been fixed because he had forgotten to call his landlord the evening previously. With a heavy sigh, Elliot Cooper stepped into the freezing cold shower and quickly washed himself. Not but 20 minutes later, Elliot was dressed in the same clothes as he wore every Tuesday to work, a piece of toast slathered in generic peanut butter in his left hand, and hot, bitter, tasteless coffee in the other. He finished his meal and packed a refrigerated tuna salad he had prepared the previous evening, along with mineral water for lunch. He broke off a piece of celery and a singular carrot, then placed the vegetables in Teddy's cage. With exhaustion clawing at the very reaches of his soul, Elliot Cooper promptly opened the door and stepped out onto the complex's front porch. He bent down and grabbed the latest issue of the Madison Gazette, which he placed under his left armpit. He arrived at work 5 minutes early, as he did every Tuesday, and as usual, he clocked in less than 1 second after the timer hit 7 a.m. By 7:05, Elliot had said his good mornings to his coworkers and logged on to his computer. The computer booted up slowly, and Elliot, after a few moments of annoyance at his company's lack of ability to upgrade their employees' equipment, finally signed into the company network. He then clicked on Microsoft Word XP and began his day of editing company legislation. Within 15 minutes, the phone began to ring. This was unusual. At 7:20 a.m. on a Tuesday, the office phone never rang. Yet despite this fact, it was ringing. Elliot Cooper grew annoyed at the ringing phone. His body still wasn't fully awake yet, and the shrill, piercing tone of the phone was enough to distract him from his work. He rolled back in his chair till he was nearly in the passageway connecting all the cubicles. He glanced towards the windows on the far side of the room and waited to see if anyone would walk into the break room to pick up the phone. The phone continued ringing. With a heavy sigh, Elliot Cooper stood from his chair and walked into the break room. He picked up the phone with his usual greeting. "This is Elliot Cooper, editor at the Ameriburger Company headquarters. How may I help you?" He did his best not to allow the annoyance to shine through his voice, though some definitely did.
"Mr. Cooper, did you know Joseph Radios?"
Indeed, Elliot did know Joseph Radios. Joseph was his boss, a man of Honduran descent. He was nearly 50 years old and was a first-generation American. "Yes, Mr. Radios was my boss."
"Did he have any next of kin?"
"Not that I know of. We don't really talk about family at work."
"I see. Well, we called your office this morning because Mr. Radios was killed in a car accident. We found his business card and wanted to alert next of kin. If you happen to learn anything about Mr. Radios' family, please call the MPD. Thank you."
The officer ended the call. Elliot Cooper now had the delight of telling his co-workers about the death of Joseph Radios, and the delight of going on a quest to find Radios' next of kin. Of course, Elliot thought. I'm the one who has to do this, even though I hardly ever spoke to the man. Why is the burden on me to tell others that someone else has died? The past 24 hours for Elliot has been filled to the brim with aggravation and dissatisfaction. Elliot wished he could sit at his desk and pretend nothing happened, but something deep within him told him that the decision was morally incorrect. With the shocking news of his boss's death, Elliot had forgotten about the newspaper. So, he walked into Radios' office and looked for photos of family members. Radios' office was decorated with medals and awards for accomplishments he had achieved over his many years on the planet. But there were no signs that the man had a family or even a lover. Radios was a good worker and dedicated his time to crafting a comfortable position within the company. Elliot began to think that, perhaps, this would make his job easier. After all, he'd only have to alert corporate and the office about the death of Radios. In fact, if he truly wanted to, he could easily tell no one and let them figure it out on their own. But, once again, something tugged at his moral heartstrings and convinced him that it was his job to tell his co-workers. He left Radios' office and proceeded to tell his co-workers. Most of them responded in surprise, some in happiness and triumph that the tyrant was dead, and others seemed to not care at all. Shift away from the same events you've heard from history class over and over again. Listen to bite-sized historical stories that drift from the normal frequency of history. Retrospection Multimedia is proud to present Frequency Drift. New episodes on Thursdays at 12 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Real history, real life, reality. Tell your stories through Retrospection Multimedia, an audio-visual organization dedicated to helping you succeed. We offer video editing, live event and podcasting services, and now, for a limited time only, sign up for the Ground Up Deal. The deal includes podcast consulting, editing, and coaching services. We will also create your own podcast website and RSS feed. Within a few weeks, your podcast will be available on every podcatcher. Order now at www.retrospectionmultimedia.com. Now, back to this episode of Retrospection Radio Theater. Elliot Cooper finished his task of telling the employees and calling Radios' bosses to make them aware right as the clock hit noon. It had been an unproductive morning for Elliot, and he realized he'd likely have to stay after work doing unpaid overtime to finish the editing he hadn't done yet. Still, he felt something good in the pit of his soul. He had done the right thing, even though it was going to cause him torment later on. He removed his tuna salad and mineral water from the refrigerator and sat in the back corner of the room, as he always did. He opened the newspaper and began reading. The coronavirus still affects daily American life. President Biden signs new bill into law. Local police bust secret brothel owner selling soup. 10 hacks to improve your immune system. Local mother lost over 300 pounds by inhaling drugs. Your sleep will be filled to the brim with nightmares. Bah! Elliot exclaimed as he once again closed the newspaper and set it down on the table. He finished the rest of his meal in silence, staring at the beige wall in front of him and chewing angrily. The rest of Elliot's day at work was rather uneventful, as usual. The excitement of the news in the morning caused the work done in the afternoon to pale in comparison. When Elliot's co-workers began to pack up and leave, Elliot stayed at his cubicle. He combed through the hundreds of words to ensure that the sentence structures of each were exactly as corporate would want them to be. The office was empty by 5 p.m., and soon the only sound that could be heard was that of a mouse wheel scrolling through Microsoft Word documents. 6 p.m. came and went. 7 p.m. came and went. For once, time was actually passing quite fast. It must have been because Elliot was working on his own dime instead of company time. That is the unfortunate reality of time, that the dead-end life you might lead takes more time for a minute to pass than when you are doing something you wanted to. It's like sitting in your 5th grade classroom and learning your least favorite subject. All you want is for time to pass so that it can be 5 p.m. and you can go over to your friend's house. All of a sudden you blink and you're 27 years old, married, divorced, remarried, and have 3 kids. Life goes by far too fast for you to focus on the future and miss what you've lived. Elliot Cooper continued working himself to the bone, and when he finally saved his Microsoft Word document, he felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. Well, he thought to himself, there's nothing wrong with taking a nap for a little bit before I go home. After all, it's far too dangerous for me to drive when I feel this tired. He pulled out his phone and set a timer for 1 hour. Just a quick nap, and then I'll be home, Teddy. Elliot lowered his head into the makeshift pillow his arms provided and closed his eyes. What he didn't realize was that he forgot to hit start on his timer. If only he had, for the nightmares that befell him wouldn't have been so traumatizing. Perhaps he could have awoken before any nightmare struck him entirely. But that, dear listener, isn't how the story goes. After all, you're listening because you want something different, something that breaks away from the monotony of life, something that tells an interesting and engaging story. I would like to have it stated that Elliot Cooper could have never experienced this coming nightmare if only you had decided not to listen to this podcast. Elliot Cooper could have stayed the same bland and boring person that everyone else, including himself, knew him to be. But alas, that won't be so, as you must have your distraction from your life, from your world, to jump into a different universe, one where Madison, Maine is home to all of the most intriguing of stories and unique of people. I shall give you this, dear listener. I'll give you these stories, these characters, these themes to satiate your lust for tale-telling. But it won't be in this episode. No, you will have to wait to the next one to experience the horrors Elliot Cooper would have to go through in his dreams. It's the closest thing Elliot Cooper could get to revenge. But just as the great Big Bang started the universe and set everything in motion, so, too, did you by listening to this story. Regardless of whether or not you'd like to continue, these things will happen to Elliot Cooper anyways. The best you could do is keep listening, because at least then someone would hear his story. Elliot Cooper spent most of his life as a plain and unassuming man. He drew no attention from passers-by, and often even his own friends forgot he existed. Each day of the month starts off the same as every other day of the month. The changes between waking up on a Monday versus waking up on a Tuesday versus waking up on a Wednesday were merely non-existent to someone used to the same life they've always been living. As with every other day for the past 5 years since graduating college, Elliot Cooper rose from his bed after turning off his alarm clock. Dressed in tighty-whities, Elliot stumbled over to his closet, which he promptly opened with the little energy he could muster. It was 6 a.m., and, just like yesterday, Elliot was rather tired and not looking forward to work. After pulling out a red button-down shirt, light khaki pants, and dress socks from his wardrobe, Elliot then walked to his bathroom and turned on the shower. He stripped and held his hand to the water, waiting for it to turn warm before he remembered that the water heater in his apartment had not been fixed, because he had forgotten to call his landlord the evening previously. With a heavy sigh, Elliot Cooper stepped into the freezing cold shower and quickly washed himself. Elliot Cooper opened the curtain to a shower and grabbed a towel. He began drying himself off before stepping to the sink near the door. He pulled out a comb, grabbed his hair product, and retrieved a razor from underneath the sink. He held his hand up to the steamy window and proceeded to wipe away the residue. When the mirror was clean, Elliot Cooper gazed upon a fleshy, lifeless form standing opposite him in the mirror. It held no eyes, only indents where two would be. It held no mouth, no nose, only a blank face. But the hair was exactly the same as Elliot Cooper's. Well, at first, Elliot thought that perhaps he was far too tired. He wiped the sleep from his eyes and proceeded to gaze in the mirror again. And yet again, the lifeless and featureless form of himself stared back. Elliot did not react in an appropriate way. He thought that perhaps he had tried some drugs the previous night and his mind was still recovering. Then a wave of sadness washed over him. Party, he thought. I've never been popular enough to go to a party, let alone do drugs. It then dawned on him that the creature reflected in his own mirror was very real indeed. He decided to pretend like he didn't see it, like everything was normal. He raised his comb up to his hair and proceeded to lather some product into it. He ran the comb through his hair, and his featureless creature mirrored him perfectly. He lowered his hair care products and grabbed his floss. The creature grabbed its own floss. He lifted the floss up to his mouth, and the mirror lifted the floss up to its mouth. He began flossing, but the creature did not follow. He continued acting like nothing was wrong. He continued flossing, but the creature's hands slowly lowered to the edge of the white, cast-iron sink. Elliot noticed, and a spark of fear began to build from deep within him. He did not, however, stop flossing. A hand shot from inside the mirror and grabbed Elliot's hands. The floss still attached. It pulled with an ungodly amount of might, and Elliot felt his 2 front teeth uproot and fling out of his mouth. Blood poured from the wound, and tears from his eyes. The hand continued pulling and yanking and trying to bring Elliot into the mirror with it. Elliot fought back with all of his might, but he was losing. He felt himself rising from the ground and slowly being pulled towards the mirror. He tried to push away. His legs found a hearty position lodged underneath the sink. He kicked backwards, hoping to dislodge himself from the creature's grip. But it kept pulling, kept yanking at his hands. Elliot felt his ankles shatter, the bones splitting and piercing from his skin. He lost his foothold on the sink and was pulled through to the mirror world. Elliot Cooper slammed into the ground of his bathroom floor. He lay prone. His hands were still drawn together by the string of floss. His vision was hazy, and he saw small drops of ink-like blood dripping from his mouth. He shook his head in an attempt to wake himself from some of the pain before turning to look within the room. The room was normal. No monster, no shattered glass, nothing to hint that he had just been pulled through his mirror. But then again, was he really pulled? Or did he slip and fall, hitting his head on the rim of the sink? Maybe this is some concussion illusion. He felt pain shoot up from both of his legs, and slowly waddled his body over to the wall. He mustered his strength and placed his back to the wall. He looked down at his legs. The off-white ball of his ankle had broken clean through the skin. Fountains of blood poured from the wound and wet the tile of the bathroom from a cream color to a darkened red. He could see exactly where his own flesh tore, as if his skin had been placed into a meat grinder and cranked until there was nothing left. The opening between his top half of the flesh and bottom half allowed the bone to exit. He felt panic whir up from deep within his chest, a true anxiety which caused his breathing to get more and more rapid. He tried to scream, to look away, but every time he opened his mouth, only deafening silence came forth. He tried to close his eyes, to pretend this was all fake. After all, he'd be okay. He'd wake up soon. His mom would be calling him to school, and the life of misery he lived up until this point would have all been a part of this horrible and horrendous dream. But every time he tried to close his eyes, he felt fingers clawing at them. He saw the squirming forms of maggots tearing at the back of his mind, trying to eat through his vision and break free. So he kept his eyes open, because what he couldn't see couldn't hurt him, right? And as he continued staring in horror, now afraid to blink, he felt those very same bugs crawling through his skull, making their way down through his body and bones. He could see little bumps from beneath his skin, inching down his chest and through his stomach. It made him sick. He tried to vomit, but as he began to puke, he felt the wriggling of the creatures crawling up his throat, desperately trying to break free from his body. He tried to swallow them back down to get as far away from his mouth as possible, but it was too late. He felt the insects wriggling within, and his mouth opened wide as he upchucked mounds of squirming insects all over the bathroom floor. Once, twice, 3 times he vomited, and when he felt like there was nothing left in him, the bugs found themselves in his leg. They crawled out of the wound covered in his red blood and onto the floor of the bathroom. But they didn't stop, and soon almost the entire floor was covered in insects. He felt himself vomit again and again, and soon hundreds of little legs filled the floor of the bathroom entirely. They began to crawl around him. His leg disappeared underneath the thousands of bloodied bodies. He screamed and screamed and screamed, but nothing came out. His voice was empty, and no one could hear him. And then he felt something slamming against his back, as if the wall itself were morphing and trying to stab him. He screamed more and tried to wriggle away from the wall like the insects on the ground, but the wall had grown arms, and they wrapped around him. He felt it continue to slam into his back, and pain shot up his spinal cord. He kept screaming, but he couldn't break away from the plastered arms of the wall. They held him still as the insects wriggled all over him, consuming parts of his own flesh. He continued screaming in silence until he felt a blow to his neck. Felt like someone was trying to break his spine. But he couldn't stop screaming in deafening silence. He warped and shook, trying to break free from the creatures and wall which bound him. He began hyperventilating. His mind began to flash to scenes of horror films he had seen in his youth. He didn't much like horror, but he couldn't help but feel as if he were in one. "What do I do? What do I do?" he yelled in his mind over and over again, trying to think of some heroic way to save himself. And then he realized that he was powerless, that he had never been able to save himself before, to break free from the monsters of his life. You see, dear listener, even the most boring of people can hold the darkest of secrets. They, too, can be haunted by eternity. His mind shifted from thoughts of saving himself to that of being saved. He wished for someone to reach in their hand and pull him out. He wished for God to rescue him, to save him and put everything back to normal. He wished his mother would grab him and hold him in her arms and whisper into his ear that everything would be all right. And then he was awake again. He was back in his office like nothing had happened. He could feel someone's hand on his back. He could feel his own dry and airy mouth like a cave in an arid winter. A pool of drool had formed at his cheek. The skin of his face stuck to the table, glued together by sweat. His skin peeled away from the wood as he lifted his head. One of his co-workers stood behind him, his hand on Elliot's back, and the rest of the office was staring at him. A woman looked in horror at Elliot from behind the walls of her cubicle. A man stared with his eyebrow raised from down the hall. It felt like hundreds of heads, thousands of eyes, all looking to him. All staring at him, with all the attention on him. He felt embarrassment begin to bubble in the depths of his stomach. Butterflies flew around and his gut tightened. He looked at each co-worker from eye to eye and then gently rose from his chair. It wheeled backwards, and the man took his hand off of Elliot's back. Elliot was awake. He was free of the monster, of the bugs, of the wall. He breathed in. The feeling of the stale office air filled his lungs. He felt it for a moment before releasing a heavy sigh. No one said a thing to him. Everyone simply stared. And then finally, an older man spoke up.
Elliot, are you okay, man?
Yeah, I'm fine, Elliot lied.
You were screaming at the top of your lungs. We tried to wake you up, but you wouldn't wake up.
I was having a nightmare.
Yes, I guessed that. Must have been a pretty bad nightmare. Did you stay here all night?
Elliot realized he could see the sun shining through the windows. It must be Wednesday morning the next day. He had, indeed, stayed here all night. He nodded his head in confirmation to his co-worker.
You doing all right? Radios' death has been affecting everyone differently. If you need the day off, none of us will stop you.
Elliot's first reaction was to deny the day off. In 5 years of working for the company, Elliot had only ever taken time to himself when his mother was gravely ill and he decided to care for her. After she recovered, he returned to work. He imagined that he must have had quite a bit of sick leave accrued. Against his moral judgment, he decided to take the rest of the day to himself. He thanked his co-workers for caring about him and waking him up, and proceeded to grab his already packed things from his desk. He double-checked to make sure that his computer was turned off, and then he left the office. With the day off, Elliot wasn't sure what he would do. He could go to the park and enjoy a nice long walk. He could go to the movies and see the latest superhero film. Or perhaps he could go home and spend the day with Teddy after not being able to come home for the evening. Ultimately, Elliot had a lot of options and wasn't sure what to do. But the more and more he thought on his options, the more he realized that, once again, the newspaper had been correct. He did have an awful nightmare the previous night, just like the fine print had said. And his boss had died that very morning, just like the Monday paper had said. He wasn't sure what he was going to do, but he did settle on one thing. Today's newspaper needed. Elliot Cooper drove 15 minutes from his place of work to his home. Parking in the parking lot near his apartment, Elliot got out of his car and walked up to his front door. The birds were chirping and singing, and for once Elliot felt like today might be a good day, a different day. He kneeled down and grabbed the newspaper from his front doorstep, and then he pulled out his keys and opened the door, entering into his apartment. He laid his stuff down on the table and went to refresh Teddy's food and water. The little hamster squeaked and ran about the cage in anticipation, with a smile on his face. Elliot turned from the cage and sat down at the table. He opened his morning newspaper and began reading the headlines. Detective Garrett Wayne's family speaks out on maimings. Coronavirus outbreak shuts down elementary school. West High Street repaved. New cafe opens after fire. Sally is back. Moldy fruit sold at local grocery. Sally is back. A moment of panic spreads through Elliot's body until he wonders, who's Sally? He doesn't have an inkling of a clue, nor does he know if he's met Sally. Are people even still named Sally anymore? Like the names Linda or Berta, it almost doesn't feel real that people still have the name Sally. At least, according to Elliot, who, in his life, has never given an original name to a pet. Sleep began to dawn on Elliot, and though he didn't want to go to bed, He realized the sleep he had the previous night had left his joints sore and his neck in pain. Just for 15 minutes, Elliot began to convince himself. He stood from the table and laid down on the couch. His mind began to wander and ask questions about the newspaper. Why did it know Radios would die? Did they kill Radios? Who's they? If the newspaper company doesn't know anything about the articles, then who is changing the articles? Are they doing it specifically for Elliot? Well, they have to be. They predicted he would have a nightmare last night, and he did. But who's Sally? And why is she back? Where is she back from? His eyes closed, and his mind kept wandering. Maybe Sally was the girl of his dreams. She was back from a different state. Maybe she was an old friend he had forgotten about, and she was back from a medical trip to Africa. Elliot Cooper fell asleep. Elliot had no nightmares this time. He was perfectly relaxed, perfectly comfortable on this Wednesday afternoon. He wasn't hoping for nightmares, but he was surprised to not have any when he would later awake. Though, dear listener, we must leave Elliot Cooper behind for the rest of this episode. For as Elliot sleeps, Sally Baker arrives at her parents' home after a long deployment in the Navy overseas. Sally Baker went to the local high school and was friends with Hope Wilson. They did track and field together and, eventually, ended up being in a group of close-knit friends. The first few months after the forming of the friend group saw the group of teenage girls going to homecoming, playing soccer together, and seeing each new superhero movie that came out. They nicknamed themselves the Spider Girls, as the first movie they saw together was a rerun of Sam Raimi's first Spider-Man movie. But as the summer neared and senior year grew closer, their Spider Girls lost a key member of their group. Hope Wilson went missing, and a college student, Virginia Harrison, came asking around. They never did find Hope. By the end of the summer, the Spider Girls had ended most of their friendships with one another by yelling and screaming. I tell you this because, as the Spider Girls began to fight, Sally Baker's home life began to change. Her mother had been growing sickly for a few years, then doctors were never able to diagnose her. That is, until she went to a hospital out of state. It turned out that Sally's mother had stage 4 terminal lung cancer, which she had received from her many years of smoking. Sally was used to watching her mother wither away, but that summer in particular, Sally spent nearly every day in the stale white light of a nearby hospital. Some of her friends would come by, but most of the Spider Girls just stopped inviting Sally to stuff. It was August 13th. Just a few weeks before school started, when Sally's mother finally succumbed to cancer. She was buried the following Friday, and soon Sally was left alone with her father. It was by this point the Spider Girls had broken up, and now neither home nor school felt like a safe place for Sally to be. Home brought back too many memories of her mother. School brought back too many memories of Hope and her old friends. Sally Baker drifted through her senior year and barely made it to graduation. But I bet you're wondering, dear listener, how Sally Baker joined the Navy. Well, as with a surprising amount of other people, it started with a text message from Corporal Dean Lionheart. A ridiculous name, sure, and Sally frankly didn't believe it to be a real name, nor did she think the other person she was texting back was actually real. But nevertheless, she texted with the supposed corporal, and his automated replies were enough to convince her to sign up for the military. Half a month after graduation, Sally Baker found herself at a boot camp. As they do with every soldier, they broke her mind and body down and built a good little worker bee. At the end of basic, she was deployed to Japan, and now, 5 years later, she's back home with her father, a widower who never remarried and lived alone in his family's house for 5 years. Sally's father resented her. He hated how she'd shut herself off from the rest of the world. He hated how she shut him out. And he hated how she ran off to join the United States Navy instead of coping with the losses she had that year. And in his mind, all she did was successfully delay her grief for 5 years. Sally would never admit it now, but her father was right. The Navy in Japan were an escape for her. She met new friends and was able to stay as far away as she could from Madison, Maine. But by the time her hand rose to knock on her father's door, the emotions came flooding back. Her throat closed up, and she felt her nose begin to run. A mental block in her mind stopped her from crying. Anyone looking at her would see a woman dressed in military garb with her hand raised and look of pure grief in waterless eyes. Sally had forgotten how broken she felt and pained she was. And Sally wanted to turn around and leave, to never come back, to run away yet again and go somewhere she'd never been before. But a part of her knew that running away would never solve this pain she felt, would never solve this disconnect with her father, and so she knocked on the door. Her father heard the knock at the door. Right on time, he thought as he opened the steaming oven and pulled out a tray of fresh-baked cookies. It was always Sally's favorite as a little girl, and he had hoped that she still liked them. Placing the tray on the counter, he hurried to the door and opened it. The two smiled and embraced in a loving hug. Mr. Baker felt a singular tear run down his cheek. He hadn't seen his daughter in so long, and he had run through so many emotions when she left him behind. That didn't matter now. The only emotion he felt was pure joy. Pure joy at seeing his little girl all grown up and looking so professional. Pure joy at getting to hug his family again. Pure joy that, for the first night in nearly 5 years, he'd have company. You see, Mr. Baker is very much like Elliot Cooper, except that Mr. Baker eventually found love and had a family. Though, like Elliot Cooper, they both worked the same dead-end jobs. In fact, Mr. Baker was the man who placed his hand on Elliot's shoulder and awoke him from his nightmares earlier that day. He had gone into work for half a day and used some vacation hours to be able to come home and welcome his daughter. Mr. Baker hugged his daughter for a few minutes. His embrace was tight, and Sally could hear in her ear the faint sniffling of her father as he cried. And as soon as Sally wanted to cry, she couldn't. She had spent too much of her life crying. She had spent too much of her life being weak, and now, just because of some family reunion, she wouldn't bother crying. Sure, she felt the same joy that Mr. Baker did, but the ability to cry had been torn out of her like a child tearing paper. When their embrace broke, Mr. Baker led his daughter to the kitchen and gave her a plate of cookies and a glass of milk. The two ate cookies and reminisced together for about half an hour. It's sad to think that the past 5 years for both of these people were summed up that quickly. But sometimes that happens when you lose that vital connection to other humans. After half an hour, Mr. Baker began talking about the future.
So tell me, Sally, how long will you be staying?
I don't know. Not long.
Where would you go?
I don't know. I can't stay here.
Sally, I know losing your mother was hard, but I miss you. I can't survive if you disappeared for another 5 years.
Dad, you know I can't stay here. It's just too many memories.
I know it's a lot of memories, but we can make new ones.
It's just not the same anymore. I've grown up.
I know. I can see how tall you've gotten, and you wear your hair differently than you used to.
I'm a different person is all. All my friends are in the Navy.
I thought you retired from the Navy.
I know. I did. But I can always go back.
That's true. But you can always stay here, too.
I just don't want to anymore.
Mr. Baker felt like a failure. He'd let his wife die, he'd worked a dead-end job, and now his daughter didn't even want to spend time with him anymore. Felt his weight crippling on his shoulders and depression sank in. The joy that had filled him melted away, and soon there was nothing left. His heart and feelings a void of emptiness.
I understand. You always have a place here, if you want it. I've kept your room exactly the same.
I appreciate that, Dad, but I got a hotel downtown. I'll be staying there tonight.
One would think it impossible for Mr. Baker's heart to sink any further, but yet it did.
I understand. I'll see you tomorrow.
I'll give you a phone call if I'm still in town.
With that, Sally rose from the table, hugged her father, and left the house. Elliot Cooper awoke from his nap near 3 p.m. His eyes felt puffy and his head ached. His body was sore and his mind was confused. It was one of those naps that, when you woke up, felt as if you had been crushed between a train and a mountain. It took him a few minutes to ground himself, and he groaned in exhaustion and tried to force himself off the couch, but he couldn't move. And then he realized that he couldn't blink. He could hardly breathe. His eyes had opened, but his brain was still asleep. His eyes darted around the room. He tried to look at Teddy's cage, but he saw no movement. He tried to force himself to roll off the couch, but his bones were frozen in place. Shadows danced across the walls, and he found himself panicking. His heart beat faster and faster. One of the shadows on the wall began to move opposite the others. A darkened hand began to form, reaching through the blackness of the shadows and clawing at the precipice between wall and shadow. It found its mark and gripped tightly. The shadow man began to pull himself from the wall. He popped out and onto the ground. Like a zombie, the man began slowly inching towards Elliot Cooper. His legs seemed broken, twisting at ungodly ways, and his head bent crooked. But the shadow bore no other features. Like in his nightmare the previous night, Elliot tried to scream, to roll off the couch, but he could do nothing. The shadow inched closer and closer until it was right on top of Elliot. The crooked head began twisting like an owl's until the gaze of the shadow man fell on Elliot Cooper. A voice came from the shadow, but no mouth moved.
Elliot Cooper, I have come for you.
Elliot tried to break free from the nightmare, but could not. What Elliot didn't know was that this was entirely real, not a nightmare at all.
Elliot Cooper, I have come to warn you. Forget anything happened. Ignore the newspaper. Return to your normal life.
Elliot was hyperventilating, or at least his mind thought he was.
This will be your one and only warning. Listen well.
Elliot jolted upright from the couch. The shadow man was gone, and though shadows still danced across the wall, everything seemed okay. What was happening to Elliot? Did his nightmare last night cause a sleep paralysis demon to appear? Is this all in his head, or is he really getting a newspaper with the future written on it and seeing shadows of men trying to pull him through mirrors and threaten him in his own apartment? With a heavy sigh, he lifted himself from the couch, grabbed his keys, and walked out of the apartment. He decided he was going to go for a walk, and that Gallagher's Park was the best place for him to be on a sunny afternoon. Elliot locked his apartment door behind him and began walking towards the park. The day was sunny and bright, filled with warmth and happiness for everyone except Sally Baker and Elliot Cooper. Birds sang in the spruce trees, children laughed and played at the nearby playground, joggers ran by, and bikers moved along the paths. Elliot walked for about 15 minutes before taking an offshoot of the main path down to a small stream. This was one of his favorite spots because it housed a park bench, and hardly anyone sat on the bench or even came down to the stream. But this Wednesday was a strange day. Not only had Elliot Cooper decided to stop at the bench by the stream, but also Sally Baker, who had spent lots of time here with the Spider Girls as a teenager. This was one of their favorite spots to go as well. Sally Baker was surprised to find a man sitting on the bench when she arrived. She contemplated walking right back up the path and leaving, but a part of her told her that this was the place to be, right here and right now. Sally Baker walked up to the man on the bench and calmly asked, "Can I join you?" "Oh, hi. Yeah, feel free." Elliot Cooper slid over the bench to allow her to sit. Sally Baker sat down next to him, and after a few moments of awkward silence, opened up. "I'm Sally Baker." "Elliot Cooper, pleased to meet you." The two sat in silence, listening to the stream for a few minutes. The quiet would normally be relaxing, but for both of them, after the days they had just had, the silence was deafening.
So, how was your day?
It was weird. How was yours?
Weird.
And indeed, the conversation itself was weird. Both parties felt awkward, and neither knew what to do to make it feel less cringy.
"This is my favorite bench in the park."
Me too. A lot of good memories here.
"I used to come here during college when I needed to escape everyone, when I needed to escape everything."
I used to come here with my friends back in high school.
"Cool."
That feels like forever ago.
"I know the feeling. Life goes by fast, and if you're not paying attention, then you get left behind."
Were you a philosopher in college?
"No, I got a business degree."
Yeah, I definitely feel like I got left behind in life.
"Do you mind if I ask what happened?"
I really don't want to talk about it.
"Oh. Well, I spent my entire life doing nothing. I did nothing in high school, I did nothing in college, and I've been doing nothing in my job. And then this past week happens and everything feels so weird."
What do you mean by weird?
You wouldn't believe me if I told you.
Try me.
My morning newspaper has been predicting the future accurately for 2 days in a row now.
Predicting the future? Isn't the newspaper supposed to write about what already happened?
Yeah. Make fun of me all you like.
What? It does sound a bit ridiculous.
My newspaper told me that my boss was going to die. He died the following day. Then my newspaper told me I'd have a nightmare, and I had a nightmare.
Sounds like you've been reading the horoscope section.
Yeah, but it's not. It's weird.
So, something happened Monday and Tuesday? What was the newspaper for today?
Well, it's gonna sound weird to you, especially since we just met and all.
Nothing can be weirder than a newspaper predicting the future.
Okay, point taken. Newspaper told me that today, Sally is back. And I don't know what that means, but apparently, you might be that same Sally.
What? Have you been stalking me?
I have not. I truly don't know what it means. I don't know why it was in my newspaper today. It's just what it was.
Let me see the paper.
Well, I don't keep the daily newspaper with me at all times. That'd be kind of a weird thing to do.
Touché.
Might I ask, where are you from?
None of your business.
All right. Sorry. I didn't mean to offend. Sally sighs. She realized she was being too rude to this random stranger she just met. Even if he was a possible stalker, she wasn't raised to be that way. Plus, she could defend herself if it came down to that.
Sorry. It's just been a long day. Lots of emotions. I was in the Navy and I just came back here to Madison today.
Oh, I see. Yeah, Madison is not the most exciting place to be.
Yeah, it's just a lot of childhood memories is all.
Bad ones?
I only remember the bad ones anymore.
Well, Miss Sally Baker, would you care to get some dinner and talk about it a bit more? Elliot was shocked. He'd been thinking those words, but he didn't actually plan to say them. Did he just step too far? After all, he'd never asked a girl out before, and he had just met Sally. If she thought he was stalking her, then the creep factor ups tenfold.
Sure. I'll get some dinner.
Elliot Cooper had just, for the first time in his life, asked a girl out to dinner. But she was not just any girl. No, she was Sally Baker, Navy veteran and high school graduate. Randomly meeting in the park, their conversation went from awkward to strange. Yet Elliot Cooper found it endearing, and he found himself falling for the stranger he had met on the park bench. He, as a man, acted out of impulse, but Sally Baker was a veteran with a troubled background. Why would she say yes? Well, in truth, Sally wasn't very interested in Elliot Cooper. Sally was far more interested in Elliot's magic newspaper that said, "Sally is back." And so, she thought that by going to dinner with Elliot and convincing him to let her come over, for desserts that is, that she would be able to tell if he was either a stalker or a liar. Of course, if he were a stalker, then not only would you know by this point in the story, but Sally would be more than capable of fending herself off against him. It was now that Sally and Elliot found themselves at a small Greek restaurant located at the end of Main Street, not to be confused with Maine, the state. This was the first street ever built in Madison, and it stretches from the Worrell Lighthouse all the way down to the Gallagher Farm. It is miles long, and often the site for marathons due to the fact that it was a simple straight line with a few hills. The Greek restaurant was not Sally's choice. She hadn't been to Madison for a long time. When Sally was around, the town of Madison was small and didn't care much for tourism, but now, over the course of 5 years and a mayoral scandal, the town has decided to reinvest its tax dollars in tourism and hip local joints for those tourists. Breweries, small exotic chains, gift shops, the whole 9 yards.
You see, the town of Madison knows of some of the myths told around. The little boy who could see ghosts, the Madison Maimer, and apparently sightings of evil monsters out in the forest. Yeah, Madison knew what to do to advertise these spooky stories to thrill-seeking tourists. Sally thought it was stupid, but at least it brought about the change for small businesses to step in. She didn't much care for Greek, but Elliot Cooper, for perhaps the first time in his life, was very excited and passionate about the restaurant. It was his passion that begrudgingly convinced Sally Baker to say yes. The duo drove separately to the restaurant and parked in a nearby parking garage. Meeting up at the top of the garage, they rode the elevator to the bottom and began their short walk to the restaurant. Their conversation drifted from favorite movies to favorite sports. Much to Sally Baker's surprise, both she and Elliot had a passion for superhero movies. By the time they sat down at the restaurant, the two were going over theories for what might happen next in the Marvel franchise. Elliot felt butterflies in his stomach. He felt his entire body shaking and his mind racing at a million thoughts a minute. Sally Baker, however, noticed Elliot Cooper's perspiration from his brow like dew on grass. Elliot was very clearly nervous, but Sally pretended not to notice. She thought it was the nice thing to do, and she was truly enjoying his company. It reminded her of when her friends first met. Everyone was nervous but excited, talking about movies, happy to be there with someone to find others that had the same interests. Elliot Cooper wasn't a very charming man. He was moderately attractive, young, and almost dangerously skinny. His skin was fair, and clearly he hadn't seen much sun, especially since Sally Baker had. But it wasn't his appearance that Sally Baker began to fall in love with. It was his nasally voice, which would be annoying if it belonged to anyone but him. It was the small strands of sweat rolling down his temple and down his cheek towards his chin, showing that she made him anxious. It was the way his glasses would fall down from his nose whenever he shook his head in annoyance at a plot point. It was an accident, but Sally Baker just met her best friend. Elliot Cooper, on the other hand, thought he was ruining everything. She looked unamused. He felt like he'd been talking for too long. Was he still talking? He should stop talking. No, but there's a long silence. When was the food going to get here? Why did he feel so strange? When was she going to stand up and leave? These questions plagued his mind until dinner arrived. Elliot Cooper felt the crushing fear of anxiety crippling his mind. He spoke not a word during dinner. Sally thought it strange, but perhaps he enjoyed eating in silence. She did not speak either. Elliot Cooper was mentally freaking out, as if he were in his office and chucking papers all around. This whole encounter was a dumpster fire, and she was just along for the food. Elliot finished eating. Then Sally. She began to make conversation about Elliot Cooper and his early life, a guise, he was sure, that she was trying to pull in order to get him to be selfish by only talking about his family and not hers. If only Elliot had known that her family was a sore subject, and she preferred hearing about others' families to make her life seem not quite as bad. The checks came, and the two paid for their meals separately. Elliot felt emasculated. He had enough money saved up to be able to pay for hers. He was less of a man because he didn't pay for her food, right? He should have. But Sally paid no mind. She preferred to pay for her own food. She'd always thought that the concept of a man paying for everything a woman wanted was outdated and stupid, especially after the stories she'd heard from her friends who would take men on dates and leave them with the bill. Elliot walked Sally to her car and opened the door for her. She thanked him, and turned to face him. They were so close. All it would take is a slight movement forward, and they'd be kissing. All it would take was a little stir in the heart which pushed out to the muscles, telling him to kiss her. But that stir was stopped dead in its tracks by the overwhelming ocean of anxiety filling Elliot. His mind yelled and screamed at him to do anything, but he simply stood there. Sally watched Elliot freeze up. She knew because she had seen that same look before on her high school on-again, off-again boyfriend, when the man wanted to make a move but felt as if he were violating some rule. She wanted him to kiss her. Not because she wanted to see his newspaper, but because she truly did have a wonderful time with this no longer stranger. So, she did what any woman would do in that situation. She leaned forward and kissed him. It took Elliot by surprise, but it was what he needed to break the lockup. His eyes closed as he enjoyed the touch and taste of her lips. Sally drew her head back, the saliva causing her lips to stick momentarily to Elliot's. It was their first kiss, and both were expecting sparks to fly. Unfortunately, life isn't a fairy tale. It's a nightmare. And as Sally pulled away from the kiss, butterflies began to fly around her stomach. She found herself nervous, unlike she'd ever been before, and with an awkward clearing of her throat, she turned and sat down in her car, completely avoiding asking the one question she had wanted. Elliot read the social cue and closed her car door for her, bidding her a good night and adieu. He walked back to his car and sat down in the driver's seat. He released a heavy sigh and wiped his forehead clean of sweat. And then, very out of character, he called his office. He left a voicemail for whomever temporary replacement would be in for Radios the next day. Elliot Cooper was not going to work. Elliot locked his front door and poured out some food for Teddy. Still giddy and full of himself, he walked over to his refrigerator and pulled out a Bud Light, the first beer of the 12-pack he had bought nearly a month ago. Tonight was a cause for celebration, so he thought, and he sat down on his couch and kicked his feet up onto the coffee table. He opened his Bud Light and began drinking, savoring the watered-down taste of victory. He replayed the events in his mind, and he found himself giggling like a group of schoolgirls as he recalled her jokes. His heart beat rapidly. His forehead began to sweat again. He placed his beer on the table and pulled out his phone. He went to his messages and looked for Sally's name, and then he remembered. He'd never asked for her number. No matter. He'd just look her up on social media. Unfortunately, what with her being in the military and dealing with family stress before that, she had never bothered to make social media. It's not like she had a lot of friends to share her exciting life with anyways. Sally was now gone. Elliot's heart sank, and he realized he might never see her again. They never shared any contact information whatsoever with one another, and Elliot Cooper might never see Sally Baker again. And this is where we leave Elliot Cooper for a little while. His story has been told, and now you're familiar with him. Hopefully you like him, or at least understand why he does the things that he does. If you do, then you understand Elliot Cooper better than perhaps he knows himself. You know a little bit about Sally Baker, but her interaction with Elliot Cooper was about to make her life infinitely more interesting. You see, Sally Baker is as much a main character in this story as Elliot Cooper. Just because I started by telling Elliot's story doesn't mean Sally isn't equally as important. Which brings us up to the topic of Elliot Cooper and Sally Baker's evenings. The date with Sally Baker was likely unremarkable for you. Even if you hate romance films, it's likely you've seen this love story over and over again. But to Sally and Elliot both, it was a brand new story, unlike any they'd ever heard. It's unfortunate, dear listener, that life is a nightmare. Happy endings don't come to unremarkable, normal people. Sally Baker returned to her apartment in giddy excitement. She hadn't ever had a date like that before. She hadn't ever met a man like that before. To have met someone that made her feel the way she did? To have met someone that enjoyed the same things as her? Though she was generally a stalwart woman, she found her bulwark of a heart begin to crumble and shatter at the thought of love. And then her mind began to race. She opened her hotel door and locked it behind her. She walked over and sat down on the hotel bed, cupping her face in her hands. These emotions, they weren't right. She wasn't allowed to feel them. She shouldn't ever feel them again. Her mother was dead, and there was nothing she could do. Hope Wilson was gone, and there was nothing she could do. She ran away from home. She bottled up her emotions. She cut all ties to Madison and only came back because she had truly nowhere else to go. And now she's found a reason to stay in Madison and someone that makes her feel something? She knew it was only one date. She knew she had met him that day. But like in a Shakespearean play, she found herself falling more and more in love with the idea of Elliot Cooper. I'll be honest with you, dear listener. It's a little bit creepy how fast the two of them have fallen in love with each other. The romantics out there will say they were meant for one another, but the realists realize the true reason why Sally Baker and Elliot Cooper had fallen hard for one another. They had nothing else to do. That's right. You heard me. Sally Baker is so detached from her emotions that, since Elliot Cooper showed some mild interest in her, she had begun to formulate feelings and attachments in her mind. She began to imagine a future with him, a future where they might even end up married. But alas, dear listener, that can never happen. Reality is a harsh mistress, and I figured I'd save you the time of an entire seasonal arc of will they, won't they? They will. And then they won't. I tell you because their love matters little to the story. It's their wanting to be together that changes themselves from the normal people they were into the people they become. I want to take a moment here to go back and discuss something I said earlier. We can afford this moment as Sally is still having an existential crisis fighting her emotions as she curls up on the hotel bed and struggles, deciding whether or not she's allowed to feel something. I ask you today to close your eyes and think about the people you know in your life. Have you ever met someone so determined to live with someone else that they neglect the rest of the world? Have you ever met someone who dove feet first into what they thought was love, simply because the other person gave them money or gifts or treated them well? Then, years down the line, they break up or get divorced. What was that love worth? Was it truly love, or did the person manipulate themselves into the false concept that their partner cared? There are too many people on this planet to fall in love with There are too many people on this planet for you to fall in love with the first person that shows you kindness. And yet that's as common as rain on a cloudy day. I'm not trying to make a statement over here. Well, actually I am, but our story is far from over, and this is just a small theme to take away from the large plot. It looks like Sally has calmed herself down enough to get up and walk around the hotel room. Let's rejoin her now. Sally has made a substantial decision that everyone saw coming. She is allowed to feel emotions. The only one who had ever told her she couldn't was herself. With the major revelation that emotions are what makes you human, Sally walks into the bathroom. She takes a heavy sigh and turns on the water faucet. She lowers her head, cups her hands, and splashes water over her face. The cool touch of the liquid was enough to shock her system and bring her mind back to reality. She was alive. She was awake. And she was in her hotel room, right here and right now. Sally turned off the faucet, then lifted her head to look at herself in the mirror. Her dark eyeliner was running from her eyes and down her face, making blackened streaks across. This couldn't be right. She didn't wear makeup. She hadn't worn it since her mom died. She shook her head and turned the faucet back on. She washed her face again and looked into the mirror. Her foundation and blush were beginning to wear off. She turned off the faucet, grabbed a towel from the rack, and began drying her face. She made extra sure that the makeup was off, and then looked in the mirror. Her face was still covered in runny makeup. So, she looked down at the white towel for any marks of makeup whatsoever. There were none. She closed her eyes and shook her head. Perhaps she was simply exhausted in seeing things. She looked in the mirror again. Still, her face was covered in runny makeup.
This can't be right,
Sally thought.
I never wear makeup. Am I going crazy?
She was not going crazy.
I must be dreaming.
She was not dreaming.
I must be hallucinating.
This is the closest to the truth that she could have said. Sally stared at her reflection, trying to gauge reality. She couldn't determine what was real or not. Had Elliot been real? Did she truly make it to the hotel, or did she die in her car and get thrust into limbo? She decided it was best to extend her hand out, reaching towards the glass. The mirror mimicked her actions, and Sally's hand touched the glass of the mirror. It was icy cold, and the very touch of the mirror felt like her finger had been afflicted by frostbite. She pulled her hand back, and the mirror, however, did not.
What?
The Sally in the mirror continued touching the edge of the glass. Sally, confused, cocked her head to the side to ensure she was seeing what was in front of her correctly. She was. Unsure of what to do, she slowly outstretched her hand back towards the glass, and just as her hand was about to touch, the other Sally shot her hand through the mirror and grabbed Sally's wrist. Sally screamed and tried to fight back. Stronger than Elliot by far, she was able to cement herself on the ground and resist the creature's pull. They struggled back and forth for nearly half an hour. Every time the creature gained ground, Sally used her might to pull herself back. She wasn't sure what to do, but she knew she didn't want to go through the mirror. Yet despite her valiant efforts, the creature was tireless, and Sally was growing tired. She reached her free hand around for a towel rack built into the side of the wall. She gripped it and held on for dear life. The other Sally continued pulling and yanking. Blood began to drip from Sally's wrist and plopped to the floor. Yet, Sally held on to the wall-mounted towel rack. It was unfortunate, however, that whomever had designed this particular hotel hadn't taken into account that a grown, muscular woman would be holding on while being yanked by a force equally, if not more powerful than her. The screws began to loosen. The rack began to shake. With another violent pull from the other Sally, the rack came loose. The tearing from the wall caused Sally to stumble. She lost her footing, and the other Sally saw the opportunity to pull her directly through the mirror and into the other world. Sally flung through the mirror at terminal velocity, slamming into the wall on the other side. Still gripping the railing in one hand, she carefully stood to her feet and looked around. Confused, shaken, but not stirred, she tried to put her hand back through the mirror. It didn't work. Cautiously, Sally opened the door to her bathroom and looked around. The hotel room was occupied by the other Sally, who sat on the bed and stared at the television. Creeping from view, Sally made for the door. She quietly cased through the labyrinth of locks. The heavy hotel door opened softly and allowed her to pass, but she didn't walk through the door. No. An object flung directly into her back and sent her flying through the door. With pain searing through her spinal cord, she grabbed her rod and stood back up to face the other Sally, now standing in the doorway. The other Sally's face began to shift and shape in an inhuman way. Her lower eyelids began to peel downwards as if 2 invisible fishhooks had lodged into the skin and pulled. Her very teeth began to yellow. From her gums sprouted a line of razor-like teeth, jagged and formed in rows like that of a shark's. Her eyes began to roll deep into her skull, twitching to and fro as they moved inwards. The whites of the eyes began to darken, leaving only the color of the pupils left. Sally could hear the other Sally's bones crunching and breaking out of place. The other Sally's fingers elongated close to an inch, but the bones kept growing and growing until they pierced out of the flesh of her fingers. The arms kept growing and growing until they pierced out of the flesh too. Her skin began to yellow as if she had jaundice. In her hand she had gripped the base of the lampshade she'd used to hit Sally. Sally screamed and began to scramble around, trying to lift herself from the ground. The other Sally leaped forward with her sharpened, protruding bones ready to cut, and the lampshade ready to bludgeon. Sally drew up the curtain rod and slammed the lampshade, shattering it into pieces. And the other Sally was momentarily caught off guard. Sally used this opportunity to stand to her feet and prepare for the coming battle. She was a warrior, and in a situation like this, she was more than willing to fight, even if it felt like she might lose to whatever this monster was. She held the curtain rod in both hands like a staff. Then, she positioned her legs in Warrior 1 pose. It was a defensive stance, and she could move in an instant or block an incoming attack. The other Sally smiled a toothy smile. With the lampshade broken, the other Sally lifted her little knife-like fingers and prepared to slash. The other Sally lunged forward at breakneck speed, her fingers aimed to cut through Sally's cheek. Sally shot the rod upwards and diverted the other Sally's hand into the sky. She then slammed the back end of the curtain rod in the other Sally's cheek, using all of the force of her muscular form. A cracking noise echoed down the hallway. The jaw had broken and now dangled in the cradle of the yellowed skin. The monster stumbled a few feet backwards. It placed a hand to its jaw and tried to put it back in place. But the jaw was broken, and it wasn't going back. The monster let out a bestial roar and charged again. This time, Sally dove towards the wall to avoid being stabbed through the stomach. But the creature saw her actions and twisted its pointed fingers to slash through Sally's common clothes and draw blood at her ribs. To any other person, they might have felt that. But Sally was a soldier, and not only had she been through pain, but she was full of adrenaline. She jumped behind the creature and gave a fierce kick to its rear. From both the momentum of the kick and the attempted stabbing, the creature flew forward and landed on its face. Sally saw the opportunity to escape. She rushed into the hotel room and slammed the door behind her. Her hands shook as she fumbled through the labyrinth of locks. The handle twisted violently, but Sally was fast enough. The door was locked, so Sally jumped into the bathroom, slammed the heavy door, and locked that one too. She turned to the mirror and outstretched her hand. She felt the cold glass at her fingertips and knew that, for whatever reason, she'd be able to pass through this time. Waiting not but a moment, she jumped towards the wall with all of her might. Either the mirror would shatter from her body's impact, or she'd be freed. Sally fell to the ground in her bathroom, adrenaline still pumped through her body, and another moment later she was standing and bashing the mirror into shards of glass. When her task was complete, she dropped the curtain rod at her side, fell to her knees, and caught her breath. The adrenaline began to recede. She could feel her wounds again. She looked down to her ribs and found no blood, but the spot hurt like she was still wounded, a phantom pain residing where the injury had occurred. Sally did not sleep that night. Every time her mind began to drift, she would startle awake and reach for her concealed carry firearm she left on the end table. The lights stayed on. The bathroom door stayed shut. Her room stayed locked. Hours passed. The sun came back up, and then there was a thud at the door. It startled Sally, of whom was semi-conscious. She grabbed her firearm, rose from the bed, and carefully walked to the door. She decided not to call out into the void. She figured that would be equally as dangerous as opening the door, so she looked through the peephole. Nobody was outside. She tried to look underneath the door, but it was sealed. She sighed and carefully unlocked the door with her gun aimed. She pulled the handle. In the absence of a person was a newspaper. It was the daily newspaper. Sally thought it was strange. She grabbed the newspaper and looked down the hall both ways. No one else had received a newspaper. She secured herself in the hotel room once more, placed the gun on the table, and opened the newspaper. She began to read. Golden Retriever saves duck from flood. Massive accident on highway leaves 3 dead. Cheese ravioli recall. Find the truth. Madison Gazette to be closed indefinitely. Sally Baker had an encounter with an interdimensional being she didn't even know existed, and wasn't even sure had a name. But to her, she couldn't differentiate between whether or not that being had truly existed or her mind had hallucinated. I'll tell you now, dear listener, you're in Madison. Madison, Maine is home to no small amount of paranormal, metaphysical, otherworldly, and supernatural creatures. But this doesn't mean that everyone knows about them. In fact, most of them don't at all. Which brings up a fact that I'd like to point out. Sure, Sally Baker came face to face with a demon or monster or whatever terms you prefer, but she also came face to face with herself. Of course, not in a literal sense, but in a metaphorical sense. She saw herself in the mirror. She was pulled through by her reflection, and she was forced to either confront herself or run away. And unlike Elliot Cooper, who decided to run away, to curl up in a ball and cry, Sally Baker saw the monster and decided to not back down. It is in this key choice between encounters that separates Sally Baker from Elliot Cooper. Elliot Cooper will never, in his entire life, be able to face himself and win. His fears will always get the better of him. But Sally Baker, on the other hand, is about to become a very, very different person. Sally finished reading the newspaper and began to contemplate her next steps. Sure, she was interested in seeing Elliot again, but she didn't have social media and had forgotten to ask for his number. Plus, she was far too interested in discovering the truth. She wasn't sure what it was or where to find it, but instead the only lead she could think of was the final heading in the newspaper. The Madison Gazette was being closed for good. She placed the paper down and got up from the bed. Cautiously, she opened her bathroom door. She was relieved to find no otherworldly creatures within. She washed up, taking time to change her clothes and carefully conceal her firearm. Then she left the hotel room on course for the Gazette. Elliot Cooper had a grander welcome when he had arrived merely a few days before. At least there was someone at the front desk. But Sally Baker stepped into a nearly empty building with barely any cars parked out front. It was as if the staff simply didn't show to work today. Sally was a bit uneasy, especially since she might be considered trespassing, but she decided to head down the lengthy hallway in hopes of finding at least one person. The hallway itself was poorly lit by emergency lights. The occasional skittering of a rat caused Sally to jump. She was on edge walking down this lonely hallway. She wasn't sure what she was going to find, if anything, but being in an empty building after last night was enough to have her mind playing tricks on her. Every shadow looked like a potential monster ready to leap out and tear her to shreds. Every flash of a light bulb made her jump, and even the distant, quieted sounds of cars honking on the road made her hair stand on end. She wasn't sure if it was paranoia or truth, but she thought she saw movement out of the corner of her eye. Her head darted to the side, but all she saw was darkness. She hurried underneath a light and tried to look around. Did it possibly get darker? Surely not, right? The flick of a light switch echoed down the corridor. Light now shone from a door much, much further down the hallway. It bled into the darkness with a pale, ghostly white luminance. Despite every thought in her mind to not walk towards the door, she did. And a few moments later, she stood in the doorway with a nearly empty office void of desks, papers, computers, and people. The only thing in the room was the shadow of a person cast on the ground, their legs bent and broken in odd ways, their head almost entirely horizontal with a neck that was undoubtedly broken. But the person casting the shadow wasn't there. Sally thought it strange, perhaps a prank the office workers played on one another, painting a deformed shadow on the ground. As she thought this, she saw the shadow rise in an almost liquid state to face her. No mouth formed, but words thundered through the room.
Sally Margaret Baker.
Sally pulled out her gun and aimed it at the shadow man. She did not reply. After a moment or two of waiting, the shadow continued.
Sally Margaret Baker, I've come for you.
Sally flicks the safety off. Her finger hovers above the trigger.
Forget the newspaper. Don't listen to it. And live your life normally.
What if I don't want my life to be normal?
Then you will pay for your mistakes.
What is the newspaper? Why does it predict the future?
The newspaper is a curse given to you to break you from your linear life.
By who?
The enemy. I am a humble watcher with limited time. Choose your questions carefully.
Sally's mind filled with even more questions, but she was able to reserve most of them for a later time. Her mind was hyper-focused on the newspaper.
Why break us from our lives?
Because the enemy offers something others cannot.
And what's that?
Change.
Are you the leader?
No.
Who is?
Truth.
Truth?
Think of truth like the brain of the body. The truth is knowledge. It lets you think and reason.
Then what's the heart?
My master's enemy.
Sally found herself bubbling up with fury and questions, neither of which would be answered satisfactorily during the conversation.
Why do you serve truth?
Truth saved me from the enemy.
You warned me not to follow the enemy. Who is the enemy?
Your truth is something you do not want to know.
The newspaper comes from the enemy, then you should tell me who the enemy is.
The heart of the body, the opposite of truth.
So, the heart has been giving Elliot, and now me, a newspaper for the sake of bringing us from the truth. And now, it's up to myself whether I'll follow the enemy's plans or truth. What is my truth?
Your truth is that you will never amount to anything. You will never solve your issues. You will never find Elliot again. But you will live a long and full life. You will die satisfied.
Why wouldn't I want to go with the enemy's plan, then?
I've come to warn you not to. I cannot stop you. Forget the newspaper. Do not see Elliot.
Where is Elliot?
That is your choice.
Yes, where is Elliot?
You may find Elliot in the park at 3 p.m. today, same spot as you found him yesterday. He'll be hoping you stop by.
Will I ever see you again?
The shadow begins to melt back to the ground. It darts across the room and disappears into the linings of other shadows. Sally Baker was left alone in the room, gun in hand pointed at emptiness, and lost in thought. She made her choice. She was going to see Elliot again. She was going to wait at the park for him until 3 p.m., and then she'd learn her truth, whatever that meant. She holstered her weapon, turned back into the darkened hallway, and prepared for whatever future might await her. Sally Baker arrived at the park bench by 2:45 p.m. She knew that Elliot would arrive soon, at least according to the Shadow Man, and so she stared off into the woods, quietly listening to the stream. Her mind began to wander, and she began to think. Truth. Truth is a god of some sort? Some ultimate cosmic being that allows for a shadowy creature to slip into the world and warn people of their enemy. The enemy. The heart of the body. If truth is the brain, the cause behind all thought and reason, then what is the heart? Love? Action? Passion? Surely, it must be the opposite of careful and deliberate thought. Sally Baker did not know the answer to these questions. In fact, the mere concepts behind each cosmic thought filled her mind with worry and fear. Did this mean God didn't exist? What are these creatures? How did they exist? Why? Why did they come into existence? Are there more? Sally Baker didn't want to think about it anymore. She didn't want to think that she was a small, insignificant speck that two universal beings played with, toyed with. She wanted to do her own thing, to be her own person, but she also wanted to live her life, and this was the way that she wanted to live. I'm going to take a step back from Sally Baker's mind. She's panicking and asking a lot of questions, and so I'd rather let her work through her issues in private. Instead, I'd like to bring up the subject of God. Don't get me wrong, I'm not about to beat you with a Bible, nor am I about to tell anyone that it doesn't exist. For at this point in the story, we know they do. Though whether humanity considers them gods is an entirely separate question. No, I'd like to ask you a question. A rather simple one at that. You've lived your life up until this point as the person you are now. Perhaps you're an atheist who truly believes no God exists, and we are alone in the universe. Perhaps you're a Muslim who believes in the absolute power of a singular God. It doesn't matter. What matters is the answer to this next question. If you discovered God or gods, were real today, but they were so different from the God you know to the point where the God you know couldn't possibly exist, what would you do? Would you forsake the life you've spent to worship a true God that you know exists, or would you curl into the shadows and pretend you never knew? My fellow atheists, if you discovered some form of God was truly real, would you find spiritualism in your heart? Or would you turn from the God and swear none existed, hiding in blasphemy and fear for the rest of your life that you may have been wrong? There's no right answer to this question. I truly do not know my own truth about these questions, and sometimes that's for the best. For no matter how much we pursue truth, sometimes it's better to live in ignorance. That's the point of humanity, right? Sally jolted from the bench, nearly tripping and sliding down into the stream below her. A hand had touched her shoulder and brought her from the deepest recesses of her mind. For a moment, she had forgotten entirely where she was and what she was doing. She was filled with fear and existential dread. But then she heard Elliot's voice. He apologized for startling her. She cleaned some of the mud from her pants and sat back down at the bench, patting the wood as an invitation for Elliot to sit down. He did so. The two sat in relative silence for a moment. Neither knew what had happened to the other, nor had either believed they might see one another again, but both were equally as grateful to whatever higher power that they were together. Elliot had hoped that she would return to this bench, and Sally knew he would. Neither spoke a word. They didn't need to. There was something in the air, a mutual understanding of one another. Frankly, dear listener, sometimes it's better to say nothing at all. Moments like these are so rare and hard to come by in life. Moments where no words need to be spoken, yet both people could hear the other's voice. Moments where no actions needed to be taken, yet both knew the actions of the other. Moments where the world stands entirely still, waiting and watching to see what happens next. There, they sat for a short time that felt like an eternity. The moment was only broken when the sound of laughter from the trail behind them cut through the silence. Both parties snapped back to reality. The world began to turn again. And Elliot turned to face Sally. He'd only met her yesterday, but something within his heart told him that she was the one. He didn't know why now or why her, but he knew. That didn't matter. She was equally as lost, especially because the sparks didn't fly until long after Elliot's had, but she also felt it stirring deep within her heart. An emotion that she hadn't felt for over a decade. An emotion that she hadn't felt since her family was whole and she was a child. Love. Genuine, true, and unrequited love for someone else. It was strange. She felt butterflies. She felt almost wrong, as if this emotion made her weak or damaged or somehow less of a person. Did she deserve to love again? Did he deserve to love again? Listener, is it okay to let yourself feel something good in the pits of your soul instead of the perpetual and agonizing sadness and loneliness that we've grown accustomed to? I know when I ask you questions, I generally don't answer them, choosing instead to let you answer for yourself. But this question, I am comfortable answering for you. Yes, it is okay. It is okay to feel love, to feel wanted, to feel valued. It is okay to belong, to be here, to exist, to live in the moment. At this point in time, at this time of day, in this very spot, it is okay. If you haven't given yourself permission yet, please do. Elliot gazed into Sally's eyes, and the shining glint of life behind her pupils. He could see into her soul, into her very essence. He didn't know her life. He didn't know what good and bad she had been through. But he could sense it. Like a sixth sense, like an empath, he saw the pain that she had been through, the trauma which still plagued her to this very moment, and he understood it. He may not know it, but he could feel her. And she gazed back at him, looking into his eyes. She saw the hurt and pain that he felt, the life of boredom and depression he lived up until this moment. And though she didn't experience it herself, she completely and utterly understood him. For the first time in both of their lives, they saw another person for who they truly were. And as each gazed into the other's eyes, they both realized something true about themselves. They finally learned the value of companionship, that all the different things they had tried to use to cope with their grievances were wrong. That the only thing that could kill that wretched parasite of negative emotion that had clawed into their very souls and sapped away at them for years was love. Listener, this is a wonderful moment that many people never get to experience in their lifetime. This is a moment between two persons who truly understand and love one another. But unfortunately, these moments are rare, and they're not always between two people that love one another romantically. Sometimes these moments happen between a father and daughter, and sometimes these moments happen between a mother and son. Sometimes these moments happen between two friends or mortal enemies. There are so many different places these moments can happen, but they're so rare because we, as people, forget to look into the gateways of other souls and truly understand them. Love is not something that spawned from nothing. Love is something that can only be gifted to another person. And my friends, love is the enemy of truth. The passion behind love goes against all human intellect, all human understanding. No matter how much you try and reason love, the passion of it cannot be truly comprehended by a human. It just truly cannot be explained. And to Elliot Cooper and Sally Baker, love and passion are the only truth they need to know. And, dear listener, will ever know. Elliot closed his eyes, and Sally lost her sight into his soul. But this didn't bother her, because she felt him begin to move on the bench. She saw his lips pucker, and felt hers respond. They didn't need to see into one another's soul for what happened next. All they needed was to let the passion take them. I wish I could say this is where the story ended. I wish I could say they lived happily together for the rest of their lives, never disturbed by anything or anyone ever again. I wish I could say they had kids and raised them, that they owned a house together, and that Elliot built a treehouse with his son. I wish I could say that the two sought therapy and fixed their minds. I wish I could say that their kids cared for them in their old age. I wish I could say that they died in each other's arms, peacefully and never once questioning the other's love. I wish I could say that this was a happy story. I wish I could say that everything was going to be okay, like it was only a few minutes ago, but I can't, dear listener. Madison, Maine, is unlike any town you've been to. It's unlike anything you will ever know. So many people get happy endings in real life, and so many people don't. And I'm afraid that in this town, A happy ending is as rare as finding a $100 bill on the ground. Sure, it could happen to someone, somewhere, and at some point in time, but your average person will never find that dollar bill. And by this point in the story, you should know that Elliot Cooper and Sally Baker are as average as... Sally met Elliot for a date at the local laser tag arena less than a week later. Elliot lost by 10 points, though he was purposefully playing poorly to let Sally win. Sally realized this relatively quickly and played poorly too, despite her military and combat background. She tried her best to lose, but unbeknownst to the both of them, the sensor in Elliot's gun had broken. He would have won if he could tag things, but he was happy he didn't. The smile on Sally's face filled him with warmth. 2 days later, the two of them went and saw the latest superhero blockbuster, specifically a movie about multiple Spider-Men crossing the multiverse into one singular world and defeating a series of villains. The movie ended with both Elliot Cooper and Sally Baker staring at each other in amazement. Neither of them could bring themselves to express their awe, so they left the theater and got into Elliot's car. Before Elliot could put the key in the ignition, Sally began squealing and shaking. He looked at her in worry, and as he did so, her excitement collapsed into words. Elliot turned off the car, and the two of them theorized and explored the film until early in the morning. It was 3 a.m. by the time Elliot lay down in his bed, alone, and with his alarm set for 6 a.m. For the first time in his adult life, Elliot Cooper overslept and missed work. 2 months later, Elliot Cooper returned home from a long day of work. He had spent nearly 8 hours editing some corporate manifesto, and he was so ready to eat dinner, watch some TV, and then go to bed. So, he prepared himself a microwavable dinner and sat in his living room facing the TV. It was winter by this point, and the sun had already gone down. Normally, he'd hear Teddy moving about in his cage, running on the wheel or making little guinea pig noises. Elliot Cooper did not hear Teddy at all. He thought that the guinea pig must be asleep. Elliot received a text from Sally talking about her day at work. Eagerly, he replied, and the two texted for the rest of the evening. He was so distracted by her text that he forgot to put fresh vegetables in Teddy's cage. Though it didn't matter. Teddy had died while Elliot was at work, a few days prior. Elliot had forgotten to wash the vegetables as he was running late for work. Teddy caught salmonella and slowly withered away. Elliot was far too obsessed with the changes in his life to notice it. So, while Elliot was at work, Teddy laid on his side and struggled breathing. His eyes grew faint, and the light faded away as the guinea pig took his last breaths. Needless to say, Elliot did not take the death well. Though he had been caring less for the guinea pig in recent months, it didn't mean that he didn't love the pig. After all, Teddy had been there for him for so long, and now he was gone. Sally Baker spent the next few days with Elliot. She slept over, prepared him breakfast in the morning, and dinner after work. She helped him through the grief he was experiencing, and even though anyone else might have thought it stupid that a man cared so much for such a tiny animal, Sally did not. She knew she loved, that Elliot loved, that guinea pig with his whole heart. And she knew that Teddy meant everything to him. She did not judge Elliot, and she would not judge him. Christmas came, and Elliot received an invitation in the mail from Sally. She invited him to join her and her father for Christmas. Normally, Elliot would go see his family, but he loved Sally too much. He was there for Christmas Eve and was there Christmas morning. Even her father, of whom Elliot had worked with, had gotten him gifts. In fact, they all had gotten each other gifts. Some were simple gifts, some were made with love and passion, some were bought as jokes, and some were expressions of the soul. The morning was perfect, and Elliot knew he had found a person that loved and accepted him for himself. So it was no surprise that, after a few glasses of wine, Sally and her father began reminiscing about the past. This quickly delved into arguments and shaming and blaming the other. Elliot sat for a little while, listening to the argument and hoping they'd resolve it by themselves. 5 minutes went by and both were nearly ready to begin shouting. Elliot inserted himself into the conversation, walked Sally out of the room to let her calm down, and had a peaceful and thoughtful heart-to-heart with her father. Less than 10 minutes later, both Sally and her father were in each other's arms, crying and attempting to speak to one another through shaky and raspy voices. It might have been that, if it weren't for Elliot, her father would have banned Sally from stepping foot in the house again. But, as the saying goes, love conquers all. And in this situation, love conquered the sadness and trauma. While it didn't fix it, Elliot's love for Sally helped her put her life in perspective and learn to love her father again. And so, their relationship continued this way for a year. Both gave each other as much love as they could muster, and received so much love that they felt their souls fill with satisfaction. Elliot was always there for Sally, and Sally was always there for Elliot. During this time, no special newspapers arrived at either's front doors, no warnings of the future, no stir from their new normal, and both loved it. In fact, they began to forget entirely about strange otherworldly mirrors and shadow men. All they knew was the love for one another. She was a better cook than him, and often prepared meals for the both of them. He was a better baker than her, baking sweets, treats, and, less excitingly, loaves of bread. Every morning he'd pack her lunch and add a special snack for her, like a brownie or a cookie. Every morning she'd pack his lunch for him and her homemade tuna salad, just like how she knew he liked it. Yes, life seemed perfect for the two. They were in love, after all, and as amazing as love is, it blinds you from some of the harsh truths of the person you love. It makes that hatred of certain things the other does like a drop of water. But even drops of water can form an ocean, and an ocean can spill out. And soon the two started realizing annoying things about one another. Sally was extremely gassy, and she wouldn't leave the room to fart. Elliot left the toilet seat up. Occasionally, Sally worked late and forgot to make dinner, so Elliot would go out to eat. She'd then be greeted with cold fast food in the refrigerator. Sometimes, Sally would disappear randomly to see her friends in the Navy, leaving Elliot worried she'd gotten hurt. Sometimes, Elliot was so dreadfully boring that Sally had to leave the room for fear of falling asleep listening to him. And finally, the worst part of it all, sometimes one felt like the other didn't love them. It was January, roughly 3 years into their relationship, where tensions boiled. Elliot had done something small, something minuscule that had bothered Sally. The problem was that he always did it, and she neglected to tell him that it annoyed her. One day, she let her anger out and yelled at Elliot. Elliot, being the man he was, simply shriveled up and did not respond. Sally, frustrated that he wouldn't speak up, left their shared apartment and went to her father's house. But distance makes us wise, and the longer Sally and Elliot were separated, the more and more the other longed for company. They truly did love each other, and they needed truth to interject and remind them that it was their hearts that mattered the most in this relationship. Both had contemplated going to see the other. Elliot thought about getting Sally some flowers from the park. But it was Sally who knocked on Elliot's apartment door with a guinea pig cage in hand and a tear in her eye. Elliot and Sally both wept, and this reunion led to the most passionate night in either of their lives. Elliot accepted Sally back into his heart. She accepted him. Their love was rekindled, and it burned bright. The next months of them together were filled to the brim with small and large gestures of love. In all this time, both Elliot and Sally hadn't bothered to read the newspaper, which was good because none of the papers in the 4 years that they had spent together had any predictions of the future. They had, by this point, entirely forgotten about the strange things that had brought them together in the first place. They planned a trip together, their first trip outside of Madison, Maine in a very, very long time. They had purchased tickets for a flight to France, and Elliot had spent the days before the flight preparing each and every moment that they would spend together while abroad. It was on Tuesday, July 21st, that the two packed their bags for the following morning. It was on Wednesday, July 22nd, that the two packed their shared car for the trip. Sally got behind the wheel and turned on the car. "Wait!" Elliot exclaimed. "I feel like I forgot something." He jumped from the car and ran back inside the apartment. He had left the keys inside. That's what he had forgotten. A friend of theirs was supposed to watch their new pet guinea pig while they were away, and Elliot had promised to leave the keys under the welcome mat. He grabbed the keys from the counter and stepped back outside. He bent down, picked up the newspaper, and put it under his left arm. He moved the mat and placed the keys under it. Then, he walked to the trash can and threw away the newspaper. Giddily, he hopped in the car and turned on a playlist of superhero themes for he and Sally to listen to. She put the car in reverse and backed out of the parking spot. The two left on their adventure. But I'm sorry to tell you this, dear listener. They will never arrive together in France. And Elliot would have known this, too, if he had read the morning paper. Because ignorance always loses to truth. The truth was that 3 simple words were going to change his life forever. Sally is gone. The final superhero song in the playlist finished. It was a wonderful theme from the old cartoons of Spider-Man, and the two sang happily in the car together. Both were off-key, but it didn't matter. The song ended with Elliot and Sally laughing, loudly, smiles beaming across their faces. Sally knew that she was in love. She never wanted this to end. Sure, they had their ups and downs, but they always handled their relationship, and in turn, one another, in a healthy manner. Elliot loved Sally. He wanted to spend the rest of his days with her, and he knew that she changed his life for the better. Those boring days of doing nothing at his desk were gone, and he wondered how he kept up with his life doing such a forgettable task. The laughing died down, and Elliot looked from his position in the passenger seat at Sally. He saw her imperfect face, her blemishes and scars, and he loved her truly. He thought of the bad times they'd had with one another, and he loved her truly. He thought of her faults, her issues, and he was glad she had shared them with him. Sally glanced to her side and caught Elliot staring at her, a wide puppy dog grin across his face. She felt her smile grow larger and larger. She turned her head, and their eyes met for just a moment. But in that moment, Sally saw something she hadn't seen since her mother died. Truly undying and unbridled love. Sally had often dealt with her emotions in unhealthy ways. She often held herself back from feeling the right mood. But now, she didn't care. It was okay to feel something good, especially if that emotion was love. She loved how awkward Elliot was. She loved how boring he could be, or rather, how he enjoyed to live in the moment without a need for the future. Elliot opened his mouth. In 3 years, he'd never spoken these words aloud to Sally. "I love you." It was a normal day for Stephen. He woke up, he showered, he got dressed in a suit, and he hopped into his Mercedes. He lived alone in a condo. He had never married. He had never found love with another person. He had never wanted children. But he did find love. He found love in his work. Stephen was a lawyer, and a high-end lawyer at that. He spent most of his time reading case files and making decisions whether or not to accept them. Most cases he declined. The ones he preferred to take were easy cases with high payouts. Regardless, Stephen loved his life. He loved his job. He enjoyed dressing up in the most expensive suits he could afford, driving an expensive car, and eating at expensive restaurants. To Stephen, money mattered little, especially because one case could pay for his whole wardrobe. It was on July 19th that Stephen arrived at his office. He was greeted by his secretary, Linda, who handed him a black coffee. He gladly accepted it and stepped into his office to begin reading through case files. Most of them lost his interest at the title alone, but something about a case from Madison, Maine stuck out. He never heard of the town and assumed it to be some small coastal town somewhere in Maine. It was probably forgettable, but the price tag attached to it was larger than any he'd ever seen before. The case was about a serial killer who had committed a wide variety of murders. Normally, he wouldn't touch a case like that with a 7-foot pole, but something was odd. The killer was a cop, and even on a high-end police chief's salary, he normally wouldn't be able to afford Stephen. Which means the case is a lie. Or somebody is sponsoring it for the sake of getting the officer less time in prison. Interesting. No matter the case, it might be good to fly out and meet with the officer. Stephen had his secretary book his flight to Madison. He would be arriving early on the 22nd to be able to spend the day in town. He spent the next 2 days reading the case files and stories surrounding the officer. Then, he read something interesting. The officer was already dead. He died 4 years ago. He had been shot and left for dead in a cave which collapsed. Perhaps the client is the family estate? Odd. 2 days later, Stephen was on his way to his client's location in Madison, Maine. He was driving a rental car. It was cheaper than his car at home, but the average person still wouldn't be able to afford it. He was driving fast. He wasn't paying attention to where he was going. He turned onto a side street and time slowed down. His foot leapt towards the brake before his mind fully registered that the light was red. He tried to slow down in time, but he was too slow in his actions. His car hit into the side of another, one with a woman driving. It crushed the driver's side, and the airbag shot out. Stephen's head flung forward and slammed into the wheel. His airbags hadn't deployed. He was killed on impact. And so too was Sally Baker. Her last sensation was a feeling of pain all over her body. One moment she was gazing into Elliot's eyes. The next moment she felt her left shoulder blade repositioned to just under her neck. Her left leg bent inwards towards the right. The glass in the window shattered into pieces, cutting all along her body. A piece lodged into her temple, cutting through the skin and into her brain. Her neck was broken. Her head jerked to the right from the impact, slamming into Elliot's face. Elliot felt the bones in his nose break. His airbag shot out and bounced his head backward into the headrest. A shard of glass shot from Sally's window and cut his forehead. Blood began running down his face and into his eyes. His vision began to dim, and he felt his breathing slow. His mind had trouble functioning. He couldn't remember much besides Sally's smiling face. He felt like she was laughing with him, but he couldn't hear her. He felt her hands wrap around his body in a warm embrace, and then joy sprang in his heart. He hugged her back with all of his might. A bright light began to shine from behind her, and he mentioned how it reminded him of her. She giggled and took his hand. She started making her way towards the light, pulling and dragging him along. And he wanted to go. Was this light France? Did they arrive? It didn't look at all like it did in the pictures. It felt almost magical. And to be here with her was all he ever wanted. Sally Baker, the love of his life. As the two of them touched the bright light, an easy peace began to stir through his body. It was like sleeping, but semi-consciously. He couldn't feel his body, but he knew it existed. He couldn't feel the air around him or the wind, but he knew it was real. And then he felt hands grasp at his shoulders. They tore into his skin and clothes. And they pulled him so hard he lost his grip on Sally's hand. She turned to face him, her face full of fear and longing. He reached for her, but he found himself pulled further and further away. Sally Baker was dragged out of reach, and yet still he fought. He didn't want this evil to grab him. He wanted to spend the rest of his life with Sally. He stirred, slamming his back into the hands and struggling to get out of their grasp. And then he opened his eyes. The room was bright. Fluorescent lights blinded him, and he tried to recoil, to get away from the fake lighting. All he wanted was to return to the bright light with Sally, not this imposter light. He shook his head back and forth and felt pain shoot up from his spine to his neck. He tried to cough, but his throat was too dry. He wheezed instead. He tried to collect his breath, but the vast desert of his throat could accumulate no moisture. Then the light was blocked by a blurry subject. It took a few moments for his eyes to adjust. It was his mother and father. They were standing by him, blocking the light so he could see. His mother asked if he knew where he was. Elliot released a faint, "No." She began to explain the situation. A man had been driving fast. He ran a red light and T-boned Elliot and Sally's car. Somebody had seen the accident and called 911. The first responders arrived and were able to save him. And both the driver of the other vehicle and Sally were killed on impact. She didn't suffer. It seemed as though the driver were in a hurry to get somewhere and wasn't paying attention. It wasn't Elliot's fault, but Elliot still heard the voice inside his head. What if he hadn't gone back inside? What if it had taken him just a few more moments to find the keys? What if he had seen the car? After all, he was looking in that direction. What if they had been going slightly faster or slower? And the question that haunted him the most, what if Sally had made it? He felt his eyes begin to tear up. Water rushed down his face. His mom stepped backwards, and Mr. Baker replaced her. His face was red, his nose snotty. He gently gripped Elliot's hand. Then he began to speak. "I don't blame you. It's not your fault. I'm only glad that my daughter got to experience her last remaining life with you. She loved you. so much. And there's nothing you could have done to stop it. It's not your fault. I loved her, and she loved you. You're a good man, Elliot Cooper. Elliot felt the pain in his neck again. He felt his whole body burn. Then, he felt a slight prick in his arm. His consciousness began to fade. His grip began to loosen. The last thought on his mind was, Sally is gone. Dear listener, have you ever lost someone? Were you there when they died? Did you outlive a child? Do you hold regrets that won't go away? I'm sorry if you do. That's a pain no one should experience. It's a pain unlike any other. At least physical pain can go away with painkillers, but pain like that? It never goes away. No matter how much therapy you go through, you can come to terms with it, but that's the best that it is sometimes. Listener, I'm sorry if you've ever had to go through that pain. I'm sorry if that pain still tugs at you like that trauma happened yesterday. And I'm sorry if the battle to recover has been tough. It's tough for all of us. Just know that you have a home here in Madison. You're always welcome to join us, to escape from the harsh reality of life. There's not much more to the story, dear listener. And I don't blame you if you think this is the end, but Elliot Cooper's story has to come to a close. And I wish I didn't have to say this, but it doesn't get better from here. Elliot was released from the hospital a few weeks later. The pain from that accident never went away. His neck still hurt every time he moved his head. His nose was always just a little bit crooked. The scar across his forehead was noticeable, and the pain in his heart ached just as bad as that first time he realized Sally was gone. Elliot didn't know what to do with his life. He spent 3 years with her. His guinea pig reminded him of her. The park reminded him of her. His apartment reminded him of her. The movies reminded him of her. Greek food reminded him of her. He never got over her. Her death ate away at him. He wished she'd finished pulling him towards the light. He wished she was still here. He wished he died instead, so she'd have the opportunity to live on. He wished so many things that happened simply didn't. He didn't want to be alive, but he didn't want to kill himself. He just existed, like he did before he knew Sally Baker. But now, his existence was pain. He received phone calls from his mother. He went to lunch with Mr. Baker. He worked his old job again. He played with his guinea pig. He had the occasional beer. He lived his life. He didn't love his life. He quickly fell into the same trap he was stuck in before Sally Baker, the woman that changed his world. The woman that showed him how to live a little bit. The woman that showed him that even guys like him, boring, uninspired, with no aspirations, could be loved, could feel something they never knew they were missing. And vice versa for Sally. She had felt her trauma ease whenever she was with Elliot. She had felt her life brighten whenever he was around. She forgot her mother's death. She forgot about her friends leaving her behind. She loved Elliot Cooper. Elliot attended Sally's funeral. He cried for her every day, then every other day, then once a week. Then he couldn't cry anymore. He just longed to be with her again. He kept working his job for years. Mr. Baker passed away from a thyroid problem. He stopped going to lunch. He watched his parents wither away in their old age. He watched his mother lay on her bed in the hospital until she eventually passed too. He watched his father succumb to sickness not long after. He retired from work 40 years later. He lived in an apartment complex in the heart of Madison. He was comfortable, but barely living. He never found love again. He never wrote memoirs. He never read the newspaper. He never saw the Shadow Man again. He never saw a therapist. He never went to France.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Retrospection Radio Theater. I am Noah Martin, creative mind behind Retrospection Multimedia. Join us Thursdays at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for new episodes. Please consider subscribing, rating, or reviewing this podcast if you liked it. If you like Retrospection Multimedia and the content we provide, go to www.retrospectionmultimedia.com. You can donate to help keep Retrospection Radio airing at the Ko-fi or Patreon link in the description. You can also go to our website to hire us for your own podcast.